Joshua Graham was born in the early decades of the 23rd century, not during the tumultuous years of the 20th century that saw the Great War consume much of the United States, but rather in the relative calm of the post-apocalyptic enclave known as New Canaan, a settlement established by Mormon survivors who sought to reconstruct their spiritual and social ideals amid the ruins of civilization, and from his earliest days, he was immersed in an environment suffused with the teachings, traditions, and moral strictures of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as interpreted by the leaders of New Canaan, where every child was taught the value of community, piety, and the labor necessary to maintain a self-sufficient society in a land where the vestiges of pre-war infrastructure were either decayed or repurposed for survival. And within this context, Joshua's formative years were characterized not only by the rigorous religious education provided by the settlement elders, but also by a keen intellectual curiosity that set him apart from his peers, as he displayed an aptitude for languages and cultural understanding that would later become indispensable in his interactions with the myriad tribes and factions scattered throughout the post-war Southwest. And while the day-to-day life of a New Canaan youth involved tending to agricultural plots, maintaining water purification systems, and participating in communal rites that reinforced loyalty and faith, Joshua also received instruction in reading and writing, history both sacred and profane, and the philosophy of the human spirit, instilling in him a sense of purpose and moral responsibility that was reinforced by the narratives of survival and divine providence that permeated the settlement's oral and written traditions. And these lessons were not mere abstractions, but practical guides to navigating the challenges of a world in which raiders, mutated wildlife, and the lingering dangers of radiation could threaten life at any moment. And it was within this crucible that Joshua developed not only the skills necessary to endure, but also the resilience of character and the ethical framework that would later define his life, as he learned to reconcile the harsh necessities of survival with the ideals of mercy, justice, and devotion to a higher calling, all while observing the ways in which the elders mediated disputes, administered justice, and negotiated with neighboring settlements, thereby gaining early insight into leadership, diplomacy, and the often painful compromises required to maintain social cohesion in a fragmented society. And as he matured, his sense of duty extended beyond the immediate concerns of New Canaan, as he became fascinated by the broader question of how human communities might be preserved and guided in a world where the old governments and institutions had collapsed, which led him to embrace the idea that knowledge, empathy, and moral conviction could serve as tools not only for personal survival, but for influencing the destinies of others, and this intellectual and spiritual foundation would later manifest in his willingness to undertake dangerous missions far beyond the safety of his home, acting as an intermediary, interpreter, and eventual leader in situations that tested both his faith and his capacity for strategic thinking. And yet, despite these extraordinary abilities and ambitions, Joshua remained grounded in the teachings of his youth, viewing his talents not as a path to personal glory, but as instruments to fulfill a greater purpose, a philosophy that was continually reinforced by the rituals, ceremonies, and community responsibilities of New Canaan, all of which emphasized humility, service, and the belief that survival without moral integrity was hollow. And it was this combination of practical skill, moral rigor, and intellectual curiosity that positioned him uniquely for the extraordinary life that lay ahead. A life that would see him traverse deserts, engage with warring factions, endure unimaginable pain, and ultimately become a figure whose legend would resonate across the Mojave Wasteland and beyond. And though the seeds of this legend were planted in the quiet streets and cultivated fields of New Canaan, the true test of his character would only emerge once he stepped beyond the familiar boundaries of his settlement, confronting the moral ambiguities, strategic challenges, and spiritual dilemmas that the wasteland presented in ways that would forever intertwine his personal narrative with the broader history of the post-war American Southwest. In the years following his adolescence, Joshua Graham felt the inexorable pull of a greater calling, one that reached beyond the familiar confines of New Canaan and into the tumultuous expanses of the post-apocalyptic Southwest. And in the year 2246, having reached an age where his education, faith, and moral grounding had matured into a coherent philosophy of life, he made the deliberate choice to leave the relative safety and stability of his birthplace in order to serve a purpose he believed transcended personal ambition. And this decision was informed not only by the teachings of his community, which emphasized service, guidance, and the pursuit of righteousness in the world, but also by an acute awareness of the fragmented, dangerous societies that had emerged from the ashes of the Great War, societies that required mediators, interpreters, and moral agents capable of navigating the complex interplay of power, survival, and ideology. And it was with this sense of duty that Graham embarked on a series of journeys that would test the limits of his physical endurance, strategic acumen, and spiritual fortitude as he traversed the harsh deserts, canyons, and ruins of what was once the American Southwest, often relying on minimal supplies, the knowledge imparted by his mentors, and his innate ability to read human behavior in environments where alliances could be fleeting and betrayals frequent. And during these expeditions, he frequently encountered isolated communities, remnants of pre-war towns, and wandering bands of survivors, each with their own interpretations of morality, law, and survival. And it was within these encounters that Graham's skills as a diplomat and moral advisor became apparent, as he navigated disputes over scarce resources, mediated conflicts between factions, and provided guidance to those struggling to maintain ethical principles in a world governed by violence and necessity. And although he was still young, his understanding of the social and political dynamics of the wasteland allowed him to act with a combination of caution and decisiveness, building a reputation for fairness tempered by firmness, which slowly began to spread among the scattered settlements and tribes. And this growing recognition did not go unnoticed, as various leaders and emerging warlords took interest in his abilities, both as a tactician and as a man whose personal convictions were unshakable. And yet Graham remained committed to his original mission, viewing his influence not as a tool for personal power, but as a means of serving those who could not defend themselves. And in this way, he forged relationships across cultural and tribal lines, learning the languages, customs, and histories of peoples who had survived the horrors of nuclear devastation by developing their own social codes and survival strategies. And these experiences deepened his understanding of humanity, revealing the spectrum of resilience, cruelty, hope, and despair that defined the wasteland. And it was during this period that Graham also began to recognize the limitations of his own moral philosophy, as the practical realities of survival often demanded choices that conflicted with the absolute principles instilled in him by his upbringing, and these tensions forced him to develop a nuanced approach that balanced idealism with pragmatism, an approach that would later define his leadership style within the ranks of Caesar's legion where he would become both feared and respected for his ability to reconcile the demands of conquest with the maintenance of order and the administration of justice, and as he traveled, Graham meticulously recorded observations of the social structures, belief systems, and economic practices of the settlements he visited, not in the formal sense of writing treatises, but through careful memory and reflection, preparing himself for a role that would require both intellectual precision and the ability to act decisively under pressure. And these formative years were also marked by moments of solitude in which he contemplated the broader meaning of faith, survival, and human agency, meditating on the necessity of forgiveness, the weight of responsibility, and the ways in which a single individual could influence events across a region torn apart by violence and scarcity. And through this process, Joshua Graham transformed from a youth steeped in the doctrines of New Canaan into a figure capable of navigating the complex moral and logistical landscapes of the wasteland, a transformation that was both inward and outward, affecting his interactions with others, his strategic decisions, and his own evolving conception of what it meant to live righteously in a world defined by chaos and decay. And by the time he reached the mid-years of his 20s, Graham had established a network of contacts, allies, and informants across a wide geographical area, which enabled him to act as a bridge between disparate communities, often diffusing potentially catastrophic conflicts through negotiation, persuasion, and demonstration of moral authority. And it was precisely this combination of spiritual grounding, intellectual acumen, tactical skill, and moral courage that drew the attention of the rising power of Caesar's legion, setting the stage for his recruitment into the ranks of one of the most formidable and controversial forces in the post-war Southwest, a role that would test the boundaries of his convictions, expose him to the extremities of human cruelty, and ultimately forge the legend that would forever mark him as the Burned Man, a figure both feared and venerated, whose journey from the pastoral serenity of New Canaan into the crucible of the wasteland exemplified the complex interplay of faith, morality, and survival in a world rebuilt from atomic fire. In the aftermath of leaving New Canaan in the year 2246, Joshua Graham embarked on an expedition through the vast and rugged terrain of the Grand Canyon, a region scarred by the remnants of the Great War, and populated by a multitude of tribes and factions, each with its own language, culture, and social hierarchy. And it was during this period that Graham's early training in languages and his innate ability to understand human behavior proved indispensable, as he served as a mediator and translator for groups attempting to navigate both internal disputes and the complex network of alliances and hostilities that defined post-war survival. And while the canyon's landscape presented extreme environmental challenges, from treacherous cliffs to harsh desert heat and sudden flash floods, Graham's preparation in New Canaan, both physical and spiritual, allowed him to traverse the land with a combination of endurance, patience, and strategic caution, and his interactions with the various tribes were guided by a philosophy rooted in empathy, understanding that communication was not merely a tool for negotiation, but a means of fostering trust and preventing unnecessary bloodshed. And over the course of these journeys, he encountered communities who had adapted to the canyon's isolation in remarkably diverse ways, developing agricultural methods on cliffside terraces, constructing shelters from salvaged pre-war materials, and creating intricate social structures that balanced authority, labor, and communal responsibility. And Graham's role was multifaceted. He interpreted not only spoken words, but also customs, traditions, and unspoken codes of conduct, which required an acute sensitivity to context, historical grievances, and the subtleties of ceremonial practices, as even minor missteps could escalate into deadly conflicts in a land where law and order were tenuous at best. And through these interactions, Graham began to understand the underlying patterns of power and influence among the tribes, identifying leaders whose authority was derived from charisma, strength, or spiritual sanction, and learning to navigate these dynamics with both diplomacy and moral consideration, acting in a capacity that went beyond mere survival to actively shaping the outcomes of intertribal relations, often mitigating violence and fostering cooperation where previously only suspicion and hostility existed. And as he continued his travels, he became an essential asset to the followers of the apocalypse, an organization dedicated to preserving knowledge and aiding those left vulnerable by the collapse of society, as his ability to communicate across cultural boundaries allowed the organization to extend its influence, distribute resources effectively, and mediate disputes that might otherwise have led to bloodshed. And during this time, Graham's personal reputation began to grow, as tales of a young man from New Canaan who could speak to any tribe, understand their ways, and negotiate peace in situations where brute force might have prevailed, spread quietly but persistently among settlements and wandering groups, contributing to a network of trust that would later facilitate his rise to prominence within Caesar's legion. And yet, despite these growing accolades, Graham remained committed to the principles instilled in him during his upbringing, approaching each negotiation and interaction with the same combination of humility, patience, and moral discernment that had guided him in his youth, never seeking personal glory, but instead measuring success by the stability and well-being of the communities he aided. And it was precisely this mixture of intellectual skill, ethical grounding, and practical experience that prepared him for the extraordinary challenges that lay ahead, as the tribal politics of the Grand Canyon were but a microcosm of the larger conflicts that would later engulf the Mojave and beyond, requiring not only tactical ingenuity and leadership, but also a profound understanding of human nature and the ability to navigate moral complexity under conditions of extreme stress. And during this period, Graham also began to recognize the limits of his own capabilities, understanding that even his remarkable aptitude for languages and cultural interpretation could not prevent every conflict or resolve every grievance, and these realizations fostered both humility and resilience, traits that would become essential as he moved from the relatively localized disputes of the canyon to the wider, more violent ambitions of the Legion. And as he continued to mediate, translate, and guide, he developed an approach that combined observation, empathy, and strategic action, ensuring that his interventions were effective, sustainable, and respectful of the autonomy of the tribes he served. And through these formative experiences, Joshua Graham transformed from a knowledgeable and devout youth into a figure whose judgment, moral integrity, and adaptability would soon attract the attention of powerful leaders, setting in motion the events that would ultimately lead to his appointment as the first Malpais Legate under Caesar. And it was during these travels and engagements that the foundations of the burned man's legendary status were quietly being laid, not through acts of warfare or conquest, but through the painstaking, deliberate work of understanding, interpreting, and bridging the deep divides that scarred the post-war American Southwest, a period in his life that would later be recognized as critical in shaping both his abilities as a leader and his enduring commitment to principles of faith, service, and moral accountability that would define him even amidst the violence and tyranny of his later years. Following his formative experiences among the tribes of the Grand Canyon and the trials of captivity by the Blackfoot, Joshua Graham's trajectory took a dramatic turn as he emerged into a wider sphere of influence that would ultimately see him ascend to the role of the first Malpais Legate under the formidable and increasingly dominant Caesar. And this ascent was not instantaneous, but the result of years of demonstrated tactical skill, moral discernment, and an uncanny ability to navigate the complex interplay of power, loyalty, and ideology that defined the post-war American Southwest. And while many figures of the wasteland sought authority through sheer force or intimidation, Graham distinguished himself by combining the intellectual rigor, strategic insight, and ethical grounding developed during his upbringing in New Canaan, with the practical experience gained in his years as an interpreter, mediator, and survivor among the Canyon tribes, thereby establishing a reputation that drew the attention of Caesar himself, who recognized in Graham not only the capacity to command troops and execute campaigns, but also the moral and psychological resilience necessary to enforce order and loyalty among the legion's often disparate and fiercely independent constituents. And it was in the year 2260 that Graham formally assumed the title of Malpais Legate, a position that conferred both tremendous responsibility and exposure to the full spectrum of human conflict, as he was tasked with consolidating legion control over territories spanning the former American Southwest, integrating conquered tribes into the legion's hierarchical structure, and executing military campaigns designed to expand Caesar's influence and secure resources critical to the survival and growth of the fledgling empire. And in this capacity, Graham's prior experiences as an interpreter, mediator, and tactical observer proved indispensable, as he applied lessons learned from tribal politics, intergroup negotiation, and survival under extreme adversity to the management of soldiers, subjugated populations, and the strategic challenges posed by rival factions such as the new California Republic, the remnants of pre-war settlements, and independent raider bands. And his approach to leadership was both methodical and ruthless, blending the moral principles that had guided him in youth with a pragmatic understanding of the necessity of fear, discipline, and absolute loyalty in maintaining cohesion among a military force that operated in a lawless, violent, and unpredictable environment. And Graham's campaigns across the deserts, canyons, and ruins of the Southwest were marked by meticulous planning, an ability to anticipate enemy maneuvers, and a psychological acumen that allowed him to exploit the strengths and weaknesses of both his troops and his adversaries, all while navigating the logistical challenges inherent in moving and supplying a mobile army through terrain that offered few resources and constant hazards. And it was through these campaigns that the Legion's power became increasingly consolidated, as Graham successfully subdued hostile tribes, integrated former adversaries into the ranks of Caesar's forces, and established a pattern of both strict discipline and strategic leniency that ensured compliance while minimizing unnecessary bloodshed. And despite the brutality that often accompanied military conquest, Graham maintained a reputation for careful judgment, enforcing punishment in ways that reinforced authority without undermining morale, and demonstrating that leadership required not only strength and cunning, but also consistency, vision, and the ability to inspire respect as well as fear. And during this period, Graham also contended with the persistent threat of assassination and internal dissent, as rivals and disaffected elements within the Legion tested his authority, necessitating a combination of vigilance, decisiveness, and foresight to preempt challenges and maintain stability. And these experiences further honed his understanding of human nature, leadership, and the complex ethical terrain of war and governance. As he confronted the tension between the imperatives of loyalty, conquest, and survival, and the moral compass that had guided him since his youth in New Canaan, and as he continued to expand the reach of the Legion, Graham also played a crucial role in defining its operational doctrine, emphasizing the importance of discipline, the strategic use of fear, and the integration of conquered populations in ways that reinforced long-term stability, while maintaining the cohesion and effectiveness of the military hierarchy. And it was through these efforts that the Malpais region, formerly a fragmented and contested landscape of tribes and settlements, became a critical stronghold for Caesar's forces, with Graham at the center of both its military and political organization, demonstrating an ability to translate his intellectual and spiritual training into tangible, large-scale outcomes that reshaped the balance of power across the Southwest. And in doing so, he cemented his reputation not merely as a skilled commander, but as a transformative leader whose influence extended beyond the battlefield to the social, cultural, and psychological structures of the territories he governed. And yet, despite the growing power, prestige, and fear he commanded, Graham remained acutely aware of the moral and ethical implications of his actions, reflecting continually on the tension between his duties as a legate and the principles instilled during his upbringing. And this awareness, combined with his extraordinary tactical skill, allowed him to navigate the complexities of command without succumbing entirely to cruelty or opportunism, thereby establishing a legacy that would endure long after his campaigns, shaping both the immediate fortunes of Caesar's legion and the broader mythos of the Burned Man, whose legend would come to embody not only the ruthlessness and effectiveness of the legion's military machine, but also the resilience, strategic genius, and moral depth of the man who had risen from the quiet, devout life of New Canaan to command one of the most fearsome forces in the post-apocalyptic Southwest. Following his formative experiences among the tribes of the Grand Canyon and the trials of captivity by the Blackfoot, Joshua Graham's trajectory took a dramatic turn as he emerged into a wider sphere of influence that would ultimately see him ascend to the role of the first Malpais Legate under the formidable and increasingly dominant Caesar. And this ascent was not instantaneous, but the result of years of demonstrated tactical skill, moral discernment, and an uncanny ability to navigate the complex interplay of power, loyalty, and ideology that defined the post-war American Southwest. And while many figures of the wasteland sought authority through sheer force or intimidation, Graham distinguished himself by combining the intellectual rigor, strategic insight, and ethical grounding developed during his upbringing in New Canaan, with the practical experience gained in his years as an interpreter, mediator, and survivor among the Canyon tribes, thereby establishing a reputation that drew the attention of Caesar himself, who recognized in Graham not only the capacity to command troops and execute campaigns, but also the moral and psychological resilience necessary to enforce order and loyalty among the legion's often disparate and fiercely independent constituents. And it was in the year 2260 that Graham formally assumed the title of Malpais Legate, a position that conferred both tremendous responsibility and exposure to the full spectrum of human conflict, as he was tasked with consolidating legion control over territories spanning the former American Southwest integrating conquered tribes into the legion's hierarchical structure, and executing military campaigns designed to expand Caesar's influence and secure resources critical to the survival and growth of the fledgling empire. And in this capacity, Graham's prior experiences as an interpreter, mediator, and tactical observer proved indispensable, as he applied lessons learned from tribal politics, intergroup negotiation, and survival under extreme adversity to the management of soldiers, subjugated populations, and the strategic challenges posed by rival factions such as the New California Republic, the remnants of pre-war settlements, and independent raider bands. And his approach to leadership was both methodical and ruthless, blending the moral principles that had guided him in youth with a pragmatic understanding of the necessity of fear, discipline, and absolute loyalty in maintaining cohesion among a military force that operated in a lawless, violent, and unpredictable environment. And Graham's campaigns across the deserts, canyons, and ruins of the Southwest were marked by meticulous planning, an ability to anticipate enemy maneuvers, and a psychological acumen that allowed him to exploit the strengths and weaknesses of both his troops and his adversaries, all while navigating the logistical challenges inherent in moving and supplying a mobile army through terrain that offered few resources and constant hazards. And it was through these campaigns that the Legion's power became increasingly consolidated, as Graham successfully subdued hostile tribes, integrated former adversaries into the ranks of Caesar's forces, and established a pattern of both strict discipline and strategic leniency that ensured compliance while minimizing unnecessary bloodshed. And despite the brutality that often accompanied military conquest, Graham maintained a reputation for careful judgment, enforcing punishment in ways that reinforced authority without undermining morale, and demonstrating that leadership required not only strength and cunning, but also consistency, vision, and the ability to inspire respect as well as fear. And during this period, Graham also contended with the persistent threat of assassination and internal dissent, as rivals and disaffected elements within the Legion tested his authority, necessitating a combination of vigilance, decisiveness, and foresight to preempt challenges and maintain stability. And these experiences further honed his understanding of human nature, leadership, and the complex ethical terrain of war and governance, as he confronted the tension between the imperatives of loyalty, conquest, and survival, and the moral compass that had guided him since his youth in New Canaan. And as he continued to expand the reach of the Legion, Graham also played a crucial role in defining its operational doctrine, emphasizing the importance of discipline, the strategic use of fear, and the integration of conquered populations in ways that reinforced long-term stability, while maintaining the cohesion and effectiveness of the military hierarchy. And it was through these efforts that the Malpais region, formerly a fragmented and contested landscape of tribes and settlements, became a critical stronghold for Caesar's forces, with Graham at the center of both its military and political organization, demonstrating an ability to translate his intellectual and spiritual training into tangible, large-scale outcomes that reshaped the balance of power across the Southwest. And in doing so, he cemented his reputation not merely as a skilled commander, but as a transformative leader whose influence extended beyond the battlefield to the social, cultural, and psychological structures of the territories he governed. And yet, despite the growing power, prestige, and fear he commanded, Graham remained acutely aware of the moral and ethical implications of his actions, reflecting continually on the tension between his duties as a legate and the principles instilled during his upbringing. And this awareness, combined with his extraordinary tactical skill, allowed him to navigate the complexities of command without succumbing entirely to cruelty or opportunism, thereby establishing a legacy that would endure long after his campaigns, shaping both the immediate fortunes of Caesar's legion and the broader mythos of the Burned Man, whose legend would come to embody not only the ruthlessness and effectiveness of the legion's military machine, but also the resilience, strategic genius, and moral depth of the man who had risen from the quiet, devout life of New Canaan to command one of the most fearsome forces in the post-apocalyptic Southwest. As the first Malpais legate, Joshua Graham's command of Caesar's legion was distinguished not only by the scale of his campaigns, but also by the meticulousness, ruthlessness, and psychological precision with which he applied military tactics, and it was during this period that his reputation as a formidable strategist and unflinching enforcer of discipline solidified, earning both the fear and respect of soldiers, enemies, and allies alike. And the strategies he employed combined an acute understanding of terrain, logistics, and enemy psychology, with lessons drawn from his formative experiences among the tribes of the Grand Canyon, where observation, negotiation, and an ability to anticipate human behavior had been crucial to survival. And Graham's campaigns were characterized by rapid, decisive maneuvers, often leveraging surprise, intimidation, and the disciplined coordination of troops to overwhelm opponents before they could mount effective resistance. And while his tactical brilliance ensured battlefield success, it was his integration of terror as a tool of control that further enhanced the effectiveness of his leadership, for he recognized that the perception of invincibility and the psychological impact of punitive actions could often achieve what force alone could not. And this approach involved the careful calibration of fear, ensuring that punishment was swift, visible, and symbolic, reinforcing the authority of the legion while minimizing protracted conflict and resource expenditure. And Graham's ability to implement these measures effectively relied on his deep comprehension of human nature, a skill honed from years mediating between tribes, navigating captivity, and interpreting complex social structures, which allowed him to predict responses, exploit weaknesses, and direct both allies and adversaries toward outcomes favorable to the Legion's objectives. And in addition to these battlefield innovations, he developed protocols for the organization, training, and deployment of his forces that emphasized discipline, cohesion, and adaptability, fostering a military culture in which soldiers understood both the rewards of obedience and the consequences of failure, thereby ensuring operational effectiveness even under the most challenging and unpredictable conditions. And Graham's reputation was further amplified by his survival of multiple assassination attempts, each of which tested his resilience, tactical awareness, and capacity for rapid response under extreme duress. And while many commanders might have been broken by such close encounters with death, Graham utilized these experiences to refine his strategies, heighten security measures, and cultivate an aura of near-mythical invulnerability among those who served under him, contributing to his enduring legend within the ranks of the Legion and beyond. And these survival experiences reinforced his understanding of the interplay between perception and reality in the exercise of power, demonstrating that the management of fear, morale, and respect could be as decisive as any maneuver on the battlefield. And Graham's methodology also included careful reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and psychological operations aimed at destabilizing opponents before engagement, often leveraging misinformation, threats, and demonstrations of force to achieve strategic advantage, and this integration of tactical and psychological warfare reflected a level of sophistication rarely seen in the wasteland, enabling him to exert influence across wide swathes of territory with precision and efficiency, and his approach was characterized by an almost surgical application of terror, where brutality was deployed purposefully and selectively rather than indiscriminately, ensuring that its effects reinforced order rather than provoking chaos. And while his methods were undeniably harsh, they were calculated to minimize prolonged conflict, resource depletion, the destabilization of conquered populations, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of both strategy and governance, and it was through these combined tactics that Graham earned a fearsome reputation not only among enemies but also within Caesar's legion itself, where his successes and decisiveness elevated him to an almost legendary status, inspiring loyalty among soldiers while serving as a cautionary exemplar of the consequences of failure. And his command style integrated lessons from his upbringing in New Canaan, his experiences mediating tribes, and the extreme conditions of the wasteland, producing a form of leadership that blended moral calculation with pragmatic ruthlessness, intellectual rigor with practical application, and faith-driven conviction with strategic necessity. And as his influence expanded, he became a central figure in both the planning and execution of critical campaigns across the Southwest, his decisions shaping the fortunes of settlements, tribes, and the legion alike, while simultaneously cementing the legend of the Burned Man as a figure whose combination of tactical genius, moral complexity, and physical resilience rendered him one of the most formidable leaders of the post-war era. And these years of tactical innovation, psychological warfare, and survival under constant threat laid the groundwork for the pivotal events that would culminate in the First Battle of Hoover Dam, the catastrophic defeat that would ultimately mark the beginning of his personal and professional trials. But even as the challenges ahead loomed, the period of his command as Malpais Legate, defined by ruthless efficiency, careful application of terror, and near-mythical resilience, stood as a testament to his unparalleled capacity to wield both strategy and fear as instruments of power, a legacy that would echo throughout the wasteland long after the campaigns themselves had concluded. In the year 2270, Joshua Graham, having solidified his reputation as a brilliant yet ruthless tactician and serving as the first Malpais legate under Caesar, participated in one of the most consequential military engagements in the post-war Southwest, the Legion's assault on the Hoover Dam, an event that would not only test his strategic abilities to their limits, but also expose vulnerabilities in both planning and execution. And this conflict, intended to secure a critical resource and demonstrate the Legion's growing dominance, required the coordination of thousands of troops, the integration of diverse tribal auxiliaries, and the navigation of treacherous terrain along the river and dam infrastructure, challenges compounded by the logistical constraints of moving men, equipment, and supplies through an environment already scarred by the atomic devastation of the prior century. And while Graham's previous campaigns had relied heavily on speed, psychological manipulation, and disciplined fear to overwhelm opponents, the scale and complexity of the Hoover Dam assault introduced factors that would test his judgment in unprecedented ways, including entrenched enemy positions, prepared fortifications, and the disciplined countermeasures of the new California Republic, whose forces, though stretched, possessed knowledge of the terrain and defensive infrastructure that mitigated some of the Legion's advantages. And as the battle commenced, Graham's initial strategies, which had proven so effective in smaller, more fluid engagements, encountered unexpected resistance, forcing him to adapt rapidly in order to maintain momentum and cohesion among his legions. And these adaptations, while necessary, revealed critical weaknesses in communication, coordination, and reconnaissance, as the Legion's units often operated with limited intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities, leading to costly miscalculations and exposing both men and supplies to counterattacks. And despite Graham's tactical brilliance in maneuvering contingents, establishing feints, and attempting to exploit weaknesses in the NCR lines, the combination of environmental challenges, prepared defenses, and overextension of forces culminated in a series of engagements that ultimately favored the defenders, and the battle demonstrated the difficulty of translating prior experience in tribal campaigns, canyon skirmishes, and desert warfare to a large-scale assault on a fortified and technologically aware adversary, highlighting the limitations of even the most skilled commanders when confronted with variables beyond their control. And within this maelstrom of combat, Graham's leadership remained both resolute and adaptive, as he personally directed units, coordinated attacks, and attempted to maintain morale under the most trying circumstances, understanding that the cohesion of his forces was as critical as the tactical movements themselves. Yet, despite his best efforts, the Legion's advance stalled, casualties mounted, and the psychological edge that had so often ensured victory in earlier campaigns eroded under the sustained resistance of the NCR troops, whose disciplined formations, knowledge of the dam's structure, and effective use of ranged firepower inflicted severe attrition on Graham's forces. And as the engagement continued, the constraints of time, terrain, and logistical support compounded the difficulties, leaving the Malpais Legate to contend not only with the enemy, but with the internal strains on his own army, including fatigue, disorganization, and the potential for dissent among tribal auxiliaries who were less accustomed to centralized command structures and sustained combat operations. And these compounding pressures underscored the challenges of large-scale warfare in the post-apocalyptic environment, illustrating that mastery of strategy in isolated engagements did not guarantee success when the scope, scale, and complexity of the operation expanded beyond prior experience, and the ultimate outcome, a catastrophic defeat for the Legion, reflected both the prowess of the NCR defenders and the inherent limitations of the Legion's operational model, which relied heavily on disciplined obedience, fear, and tactical ingenuity, but lacked the technological infrastructure, supply chains, and engineering support necessary to seize and hold a critical asset, such as the Hoover Dam. And while the loss represented a significant setback in Caesar's broader campaign to dominate the region, it also provided Graham with invaluable lessons regarding the integration of intelligence, logistics, and combined arms tactics, lessons that would inform both his future military decisions and his understanding of the limits of even the most disciplined and loyal forces. And the aftermath of the battle, though marked by physical retreat and operational failure, did not diminish Graham's status as a formidable commander, as his personal bravery, ability to adapt under pressure, and the loyalty he inspired among surviving troops reinforced the perception of him as a leader capable of extraordinary resilience and tactical insight. And yet, the defeat also planted the seeds of personal and professional crises that would soon lead to his dramatic fall, the attempted execution by Caesar, and the events that would transform him into the Burned Man, a figure whose legend would endure across the wasteland for generations. And thus, The First Battle of Hoover Dam stands as both a testament to Joshua Graham's capabilities as a tactician and a turning point in his life, illustrating the interplay between skill, circumstance, and the unpredictable forces of war in shaping both history and myth. And it is within this complex and devastating engagement that one can trace the contours of his rise, the limitations of even the most meticulous strategy, and the beginning of a series of events that would forever intertwine his personal narrative with the broader story of Caesar's legion and the post-apocalyptic Southwest, leaving an indelible mark on both the survivors of the battle and the enduring legend of Joshua Graham. In the aftermath of the catastrophic defeat at the First Battle of Hoover Dam in the year 2270, Joshua Graham's life reached a dramatic and near-fatal turning point when Caesar, enraged by the failure of his most trusted legate, and seeking both retribution and a demonstration of his authority, ordered Graham to be executed in a manner designed to leave no possibility of survival, and the method chosen was as extreme as it was symbolic. Graham was stripped, doused in pitch, and set ablaze at the edge of the Grand Canyon, the flames consuming his flesh while the heat and smoke threatened to overwhelm his senses. And in that instant, the culmination of years of service, strategic brilliance, and unflinching loyalty seemed destined to end in absolute annihilation. Yet Joshua Graham, drawing upon the extraordinary physical resilience honed through decades of survival in the harshest environments of the post-apocalyptic Southwest, the mental fortitude developed during years of captivity and negotiation among hostile tribes, and the spiritual grounding instilled during his upbringing in New Canaan, endured a level of suffering that would have destroyed most mortals, and against all expectations, he survived, emerging from the inferno, gravely injured, but remarkably alive, a testament to the combination of human endurance, willpower, and the almost mythic resilience that would come to define his later legend as the Burned Man. And the circumstances of his survival, though shrouded in pain, disfigurement, and the harrowing process of recovery, marked the beginning of a profound transformation, both physically and psychologically, as the experience forced him to confront the extremes of human cruelty, the fragility of life, and the necessity of moral clarity in the face of overwhelming adversity. And as he struggled to navigate the immediate aftermath of the attempted execution, crawling and stumbling along the treacherous edges of the Grand Canyon while contending with burns, exposure, and the lingering threat of predators and hostile humans alike, Graham relied on a combination of instinct, learned survival techniques, and sheer determination to reach relative safety, demonstrating that even in circumstances designed to guarantee death, resilience, strategy, and faith could prevail. And it was during this arduous journey that he began the process of internalizing the lessons of his near extinction, recognizing the value of survival not as a mere continuation of life, but as an opportunity to reflect, to atone, and to realign his actions with the moral principles that had guided him since his youth in New Canaan. And these reflections, forged under the crucible of unimaginable pain and near total annihilation, would come to inform his later choices, philosophy, and leadership, as he reconciled the necessity of pragmatic action with an unwavering commitment to the ethical framework he had cultivated over decades. And while the burns and disfigurement marked him physically, transforming his appearance into a symbol of both suffering and resilience, they also reinforced the psychological and spiritual dimensions of his survival, serving as constant reminders of human vulnerability, endurance, and the consequences of moral and strategic decisions in a world defined by violence and scarcity. and the legend of the burned man, which would spread across the Mojave Wasteland and beyond, originated in this moment, as tales of his miraculous survival, endurance of the flames, and eventual return to society began to circulate among survivors, raiders, and tribes, illustrating both the power of myth and the human capacity to endure and transcend even the most extreme trials. And in the broader context of the post-war Southwest, this episode represented not merely a personal trial, but a symbolic intersection of faith, morality, and the brutal realities of leadership under Caesar, highlighting the precarious balance between loyalty, obedience, and the unpredictable consequences of both success and failure in the execution of military and political strategy. And as Graham began the slow process of recovery, aided in part by the sparse resources of the canyon, his knowledge of terrain, foraging, and survival techniques allowed him to gradually regain strength and mobility, while his mental resilience enabled him to process the trauma, assess the lessons inherent in his survival, and begin to formulate a philosophy that would guide his subsequent actions, interactions with others, and eventual reintegration into the post-war social and spiritual fabric of the region. And the physical and psychological transformations resulting from this event would forever alter both his capabilities and his outlook, reinforcing his capacity for endurance, strategic thinking, and moral discernment, and establishing a narrative that would resonate far beyond his immediate circumstances, inspiring both fear and respect. And ultimately, the fall into the Grand Canyon not only marked the end of one chapter in Joshua Graham's life, but also the dramatic beginning of another, one in which survival, faith, and the forging of legend became inseparably intertwined, setting the stage for his return to New Canaan, the reassertion of spiritual purpose, and the enduring mythos of the burned man that would define his legacy across the wasteland and throughout post-apocalyptic history. After surviving the horrific execution attempt by Caesar in the year 2270, Joshua Graham began the arduous and grueling journey back to New Canaan, a path that demanded extraordinary physical endurance, mental fortitude, and spiritual reflection. As he navigated the northern edges of the Grand Canyon, a landscape of jagged cliffs, unstable rock formations, and harsh desert conditions that tested the limits of even the most resilient survivors. And throughout this journey, Graham relied on the survival skills honed over decades of traversing the post-apocalyptic Southwest, including his knowledge of edible flora, navigation by the sun and stars, and the utilization of natural shelters to conserve energy and protect himself from both environmental hazards and the ever-present threats posed by raiders, mutated wildlife, and the unpredictable remnants of pre-war infrastructure. And while his body was severely scarred and weakened by the burns, smoke inhalation, and trauma from his execution, his unwavering determination, disciplined mindset, and spiritual grounding allowed him to persevere, step by painstaking step, through terrain that would have claimed the life of an ordinary man. And it was during this period of extreme suffering and isolation that Graham's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the events that had brought him to this point, including his early life in New Canaan, his missionary and interpreter work among the Canyon tribes, his role in Caesar's legion, and the moral compromises and strategic decisions that had shaped his rise to prominence and subsequent downfall. And this period of introspection, imposed by circumstance, allowed him to re-evaluate his relationship with faith, justice, and personal responsibility, deepening his understanding of the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. and reinforcing his commitment to live a life guided by principles rather than by vengeance or ambition. And as he continued his journey, he encountered both natural and human challenges, from sudden flash floods in canyon gorges to the sporadic presence of hostile raiders and scavengers, each of which demanded careful planning, tactical awareness, and, when possible, the avoidance of direct confrontation. And these trials, while physically exhausting, also reinforced the mental discipline that had been central to his survival, allowing him to maintain focus, ration resources, and navigate complex terrain despite pain, exhaustion, and the constant awareness of mortality. And as the days and weeks passed, Graham's journey became not only a physical odyssey, but a spiritual pilgrimage, a movement through the harsh wilderness that mirrored the inner process of healing, forgiveness, and self-examination. And in this reflective state, he revisited the ethical lessons of his youth in New Canaan, recognizing the importance of humility, service, and moral clarity in guiding actions, while also integrating the pragmatic insights gained from his years as a military commander, interpreter, and survivor in the wasteland. And this integration of moral philosophy with practical experience became the foundation for the spiritual transformation that would define his later life, shaping both his personal identity and his approach to leadership, conflict resolution, and engagement with others. And upon finally reaching New Canaan, Graham faced the challenge of reintegration, navigating a community that had evolved during his absence, which required patience, humility, and an acute sensitivity to the social and spiritual dynamics that governed life within the settlement. And his return was not marked by triumph or celebration, but by a quiet, deliberate process of re-establishing relationships, contributing to communal life, and demonstrating through actions rather than words the lessons learned from his extraordinary experiences. And it was through this reintegration that Graham solidified his identity as a figure transformed by suffering and survival, one whose faith was tempered by the realities of the wasteland, whose moral compass was refined through trial, and whose resilience had been proven under circumstances that would have overwhelmed any ordinary individual. And the spiritual transformation that occurred during this period was profound as he reconciled his past actions, both heroic and morally ambiguous, with a renewed commitment to live in accordance with the ethical and spiritual principles instilled during his upbringing, understanding that the purpose of survival extended beyond mere existence to encompass service, guidance, and the careful cultivation of virtue in a world defined by chaos, scarcity, and human frailty. And through this process, Graham emerged not only as a survivor, but as a moral and spiritual exemplar, whose experiences, endurance, and reflections would inform his interactions, leadership, and the ethical framework he would employ in the years to come, laying the groundwork for the development of his legend as the Burned Man, a figure who embodied resilience, faith, and the capacity for transformation in a world ravaged by atomic fire. And it was in the quiet streets, fields, and temples of New Canaan that Graham, having endured unimaginable pain, near total annihilation, and profound moral and strategic trials, began to reconcile the disparate elements of his life, integrating the lessons of the wasteland with the principles of his youth, and in doing so, he set the stage for the next phase of his journey, one defined not by conquest or survival alone, but by the application of faith, wisdom, and moral authority in guiding others, reflecting on past atrocities, and solidifying the enduring mythos that would come to define Joshua Graham across the Mojave Wasteland. and beyond. Following his miraculous survival and return to New Canaan, Joshua Graham entered a profound period of introspection and spiritual re-evaluation, a time during which he confronted the weight of his past actions as a legate of Caesar's legion, the atrocities he had committed under the banner of conquest and loyalty, and the moral ambiguities inherent in a life spent navigating a world defined by violence, scarcity, and human desperation. And it was within the sanctity of his childhood community, surrounded by the teachings and rituals of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as interpreted in New Canaan, that Graham began to reconcile the duality of his existence, the tension between the ruthless efficiency required for survival and command in the wasteland, and the ethical principles that had guided him since youth, reflecting deeply on questions of justice, retribution, mercy, and the nature of human fallibility. And this period of reflection was not merely theoretical, but intertwined with practical moral deliberation, as he considered the consequences of past campaigns, the suffering inflicted upon tribes, settlements, and individuals, and the responsibility he bore for perpetuating cycles of violence under Caesar's orders. And in doing so, Graham confronted the stark reality that while obedience and tactical skill had elevated him to positions of power and notoriety, they had come at immense moral cost, prompting an inward dialogue that explored the possibility of redemption, forgiveness, and spiritual renewal. And it was during these meditative and often painful examinations of conscience that Graham developed a philosophy which emphasized the power of forgiveness as a moral imperative, distinct from acquiescence to wrongdoing, recognizing that one could forgive without condoning past atrocities, and that the act of forgiveness could serve both as a mechanism for personal healing and as a guide for moral leadership in a fractured, post-apocalyptic society. And central to this philosophy was his nuanced engagement with the figure of Caesar, whose ambition, charisma, and brutality had both shaped and corrupted the legion. And while Graham understood the magnitude of Caesar's offenses, he discerned the importance of separating personal vengeance from ethical clarity, choosing to forgive the man in a spiritual and moral sense without absolving or excusing the systemic sins of the legion itself, a distinction that required both intellectual rigor and profound emotional discipline. And this reconciliation with Caesar in the realm of moral reasoning allowed Graham to release the corrosive effects of hatred, rage, and the desire for retribution, channeling the energy of his experiences into acts of constructive service, reflection, and guidance for others. And in doing so, he created a framework through which survivors, disciples, and followers could navigate the complex ethical landscapes of the wasteland, learning to balance survival, loyalty, and faith with justice, mercy, and moral accountability. And this evolution of character was further reinforced by Graham's renewed commitment to the rituals, study, and spiritual disciplines of New Canaan, practices that grounded him in a sense of continuity, identity, and purpose, while providing the contemplative space necessary to integrate the lessons of a life marked by extraordinary trials, leadership challenges, and exposure to human depravity. And during this transformative period, Graham also began to articulate a vision of moral authority that emphasized example over coercion, teaching that influence derived not solely from fear or power, but from the consistent application of ethical principles, courage under duress, and the willingness to act in accordance with one's convictions, even in the absence of external reward or recognition. and it was through this approach that he reconstructed his sense of self, transitioning from a figure defined by military command and strategic ruthlessness into a spiritual and moral exemplar, a man whose guidance, teaching, and presence provided both practical and ethical leadership to communities navigating the aftermath of the Great War. And, as Graham engaged with both his inner struggles and the external realities of the wasteland, he recognized that faith was not a static inheritance from childhood, but a dynamic, lived practice, one that required continual reflection, humility, and the courage to confront one's own complicity in past wrongs, while striving to act justly in the present. And this understanding allowed him to develop a philosophy in which forgiveness, moral clarity, and strategic wisdom were interdependent, guiding both personal conduct and interactions with others in ways that fostered reconciliation, resilience, and social cohesion in a fragmented world. And it was within this framework that Graham found the strength to forgive Caesar, not as an act of weakness or submission, but as a deliberate moral and spiritual choice, asserting his agency, affirming his values, and freeing himself from the corrosive influence of hatred, while simultaneously maintaining a vigilant ethical standard that rejected complicity with injustice, cruelty, or exploitation. And this period of moral evolution, grounded in faith, reflection, and lived experience, ultimately shaped Joshua Graham into a figure whose authority and influence extended far beyond physical prowess or military genius, encompassing a capacity for ethical leadership, spiritual guidance, and the cultivation of resilience among those who looked to him for example and counsel. And through this integration of forgiveness, faith, and moral accountability, Graham achieved a synthesis of identity and purpose, reconciling the burned man of legend with the devout, disciplined, and contemplative man he had been in New Canaan, thereby laying the foundation for the enduring legend, influence, and mythos that would define him in the Mojave Wasteland and across the broader post-apocalyptic Southwest, illustrating that even amidst the remnants of a shattered civilization, the human capacity for reflection, redemption, and moral evolution could survive, flourish, and inspire. And it is this period of introspection, reconciliation, and spiritual refinement that forms the core of Joshua Graham's philosophy, demonstrating the power of forgiveness and faith to transform a life marked by violence, suffering, and the weight of impossible choices into a legacy of moral clarity, ethical leadership, and enduring human resilience. In the years following his miraculous survival, spiritual reconciliation, and moral transformation, Joshua Graham, once the first Malpais legate of Caesar's legion, emerged from the shadows of the Grand Canyon and the ravaged expanses of the post-apocalyptic Southwest as a figure whose story transcended ordinary human experience. And it was during this period that the legend of the burned man began to crystallize, a mythos born from both awe and fear, as survivors, travelers, and those who had heard whispers of the Malpais campaigns recounted tales of a man who had endured unimaginable suffering, having been set aflame at the hands of Caesar himself, yet who not only survived but returned with unbroken resolve, a living testament to resilience, cunning, and a will that defied mortal limits. And this legend, though rooted in historical events, took on a life of its own, spreading across settlements, trading posts, and wandering tribes like wildfire, carried by those who had glimpsed Graham's presence, those who had benefited from his guidance or intervention, and even those who feared the consequences of encountering him. as the image of a man whose skin bore the scars of fire became a potent symbol in the collective consciousness of the Mojave Wasteland, a symbol representing both the brutal realities of survival and the possibility of transcendence beyond ordinary human suffering. And as these stories proliferated, the burned man became a figure whose reputation was both fearsome and reverential, a paradox that encapsulated the duality of Joshua Graham's life, as both a man of extraordinary violence in his years with Caesar's legion, and a man of profound moral and spiritual reflection in the years following his return to New Canaan. And it was precisely this duality that fueled the fascination, speculation, and oral histories that elevated him beyond mere mortality, as accounts described him not only as a survivor of execution by fire, but as a master of endurance, strategy, and moral judgment, a man capable of influencing events through wisdom, courage, and example. And even Caesar himself, despite his attempts to erase Graham from memory or assert dominion over his narrative, could not extinguish the legend, as the sheer improbability of survival, combined with Graham's subsequent actions and teachings, ensured that his story would endure in the minds and oral traditions of those who encountered him, witnessed his resilience, or heard of the man who had returned from death's edge. And the burned man's legend was amplified by the details of his survival, which emphasized not merely physical resilience, but also the interplay of intellect, spiritual discipline, and strategic awareness that had enabled him to navigate a landscape fraught with danger, adversity, and the lingering influence of those who sought his demise. And as these accounts spread, Graham's mythos became intertwined with broader narratives of moral redemption, faith, and the capacity for humans to endure and transform even after the most catastrophic events, creating a layered reputation that encompassed awe-inspiring survival, ethical contemplation, and the practical application of wisdom in guiding others through the desolation of the wasteland. And the legend itself took on a performative aspect, as those who spoke of the burned man imbued his story with lessons and warnings, reinforcing social norms, cautionary tales, and ethical considerations, while simultaneously inspiring courage, resilience, and admiration among those who sought examples of perseverance in a world defined by chaos, scarcity, and violence. And through this process, Joshua Graham became both a historical figure and a mythic archetype, a man whose lived experiences and deliberate choices shaped a narrative that transcended the limitations of ordinary human memory, merging fact with storytelling, reality with moral and symbolic resonance, and personal survival with communal inspiration. And even within communities that had not seen him directly, Graham's legend influenced behavior, decision-making, and the moral frameworks of leaders, settlers, and wandering groups, demonstrating the power of myth to shape social dynamics, cultural memory, and the perception of authority in the fragmented post-apocalyptic society. And, as the years passed, the stories of the burned man evolved, incorporating elements of his survival, his unwavering moral reflection, his strategic brilliance, and his spiritual resilience, creating a composite figure whose presence, even when absent, was felt across the Mojave, and whose reputation as both a cautionary and inspirational figure shaped interactions, alliances, and conflicts in ways that extended far beyond his immediate sphere of influence. And it was this combination of physical endurance, ethical reflection, and tactical acumen, amplified by the human tendency to mythologize extraordinary individuals, that ensured Joshua Graham's enduring place within the cultural and historical landscape of the wasteland and the legend itself became a medium through which the people of the Southwest articulated their understanding of human potential, resilience, and morality, embodying lessons about the consequences of violence, the capacity for redemption, and the strength of the human spirit. And in this way, the burned man transcended the limitations of biography or military record, becoming a symbol, a story, and a moral touchstone, whose influence persisted not only in the recollections of those who had witnessed his survival and actions, but also in the aspirations, fears, and ethical reasoning of communities that sought to interpret the meaning of his extraordinary life. And the legend of the burned man, rooted in the crucible of fire, adversity, and moral reckoning, thus stands as both a historical account of survival and a narrative construct that continues to shape the post-apocalyptic Southwest, illustrating the intersection of myth, morality, and memory, and solidifying Joshua Graham as a figure whose life, choices, and endurance exemplify the potential for human transformation, the capacity for resilience under unimaginable adversity, and the enduring power of narrative to inspire, caution, and guide in a world rebuilt from atomic fire. In the years following his miraculous survival and the establishment of his moral and spiritual authority, Joshua Graham, the burned man of Mojave legend, faced relentless pursuit from Caesar's legion, whose intelligence and covert operations were embodied in the Frumentari, a shadowy network of spies, informants, and assassins whose mandate was to eliminate threats, enforce loyalty, and maintain Caesar's dominion across the post-apocalyptic Southwest. And it was within this climate of persistent danger that Graham's abilities in strategy, vigilance, and psychological acumen were tested anew as he had to anticipate the methods, timing, and motivations of a clandestine force trained in deception, infiltration, and lethal precision, and the Frumentarii, cognizant of Graham's knowledge of their tactics, resources, and operational structures, approached their task with meticulous planning, attempting to exploit the man's physical vulnerability from his burns, the isolation of his movements, and the predictable routes and habits he maintained in traveling between communities. And yet, Graham's response to this constant threat was neither panic nor retreat, but a systematic application of survival skills, informed by his experiences among the Canaan tribes, his military campaigns as Malpais Legate, and the introspective, spiritually grounded philosophy he had cultivated in New Canaan, and his strategy for evasion, combined mobility, misdirection, intelligence gathering, and the careful use of terrain, exploiting the knowledge of the wasteland's geography and the patterns of both natural and human activity to reduce exposure to ambush, while simultaneously leveraging relationships with local communities, traders, and allies who could provide warnings, support, and shelter. And this network of information and assistance proved critical in enabling him to anticipate attacks, counter the tactics of the Frumentari, and protect both himself and those who assisted him, establishing a dynamic of respect, caution, and mutual obligation that reinforced his position and influence even while under threat. And the repeated attempts on his life, though intended to eliminate him, instead honed Graham's capacity for vigilance, risk assessment, and rapid response, each engagement, or near miss, providing insights into enemy psychology, operational methodology, and the limitations of their surveillance and strike capabilities. And over time, Graham developed a layered approach to survival, incorporating contingency planning, redundant escape routes, and the careful calibration of exposure, ensuring that no single point of failure could result in capture or death, And this meticulous attention to detail, drawn from both practical experience and disciplined training, became a hallmark of his later movements, as he navigated a world in which threats could appear unpredictably and with lethal consequences. And while physical security was paramount, Graham's strategies also encompassed psychological resilience, mental conditioning, and the cultivation of a demeanor that projected confidence, calm, and awareness, thereby reducing the likelihood that adversaries could exploit fear, hesitation, or doubt. And these traits, combined with his reputation as the burned man, created an additional layer of deterrence, as even the Frumentari, trained to eliminate targets through fear and precision, approached their missions with heightened caution and awareness of the near-mythical nature of their quarry. And in parallel, Graham employed counterintelligence, spreading misinformation, monitoring potential informants, and leveraging knowledge of Caesar's organizational priorities to preemptively disrupt attempts at ambush, infiltration, or assassination, a practice that required both intellectual rigor and the ability to anticipate multiple layers of adversarial thought. And in doing so, he turned the pursuit of his life into an extended exercise in strategy, observation, and human understanding, reinforcing the perception that the burned man was not only physically resilient, but mentally formidable, capable of outthinking an organization whose power relied on secrecy, surprise, and psychological manipulation. And the constant threat from the Frumentari also served as a crucible for Graham's ethical philosophy, testing the balance between self-preservation, moral responsibility to allies, and the broader consequences of action and inaction in a violent and unpredictable world. And it was in navigating these challenges that he refined the integration of faith, morality, and tactical acumen, demonstrating that survival in the wasteland demanded both physical resilience and an unwavering commitment to principles that transcended fear and immediate self-interest. And over the ensuing years, Graham's ability to evade, counter, and manipulate the activities of the Frumentari contributed to the continued growth of his legend, reinforcing the dual perception of him as both a miraculous survivor and a strategically unparalleled adversary, a man whose awareness of danger and mastery of human behavior allowed him to live among the remnants of society while remaining effectively untouchable. And the interactions, near engagements, and intelligence-gathering exercises that arose from this persistent threat provided further material for the stories, myths, and oral traditions that spread across the Mojave, amplifying the mystique of the burned man as a figure whose combination of resilience, wisdom, and moral clarity placed him outside the ordinary limits of human capability. And in this context, the presence of the Frumentari and assassins, far from diminishing Graham's influence or legend, actually enhanced it, creating a narrative in which he was simultaneously hunted, feared, revered, and ultimately untouchable. A man whose life and actions embodied the intersection of human cunning, survival, instinct, and moral authority. And through this prolonged period of vigilance and evasion, Graham exemplified the practical application of the principles he had developed throughout his life, demonstrating that the combination of strategic foresight, ethical consistency, and personal discipline could not only preserve life, but reinforce influence, authority, and legend. In a world where conventional power structures had collapsed, and it was this mastery of survival under existential threat, coupled with the mythic resonance of his earlier trials and moral evolution, that ensured the burned man remained an enduring figure of both historical and symbolic significance, shaping perceptions of leadership, resilience, and morality in the Mojave Wasteland, and securing Joshua Graham's place as one of the most formidable and legendary figures in the post-apocalyptic Southwest. Joshua Graham, the Burned Man, quickly became a pivotal figure in the unfolding conflict in Zion Canyon, a landscape both rugged and sacred, where the encroachment of hostile factions threatened the fragile equilibrium of the region. And it was within this crucible that Graham's experience as a military strategist, survivor, and ethical leader converged, allowing him to exert influence over both the planning and execution of campaigns aimed at defending the canyon, its inhabitants, and the principles he had cultivated since his return to New Canaan. And the War for Zion, a series of engagements spanning months and involving multiple factions including the Whitelegs, local tribes, and scattered raider groups, presented a complex tactical and moral challenge as the terrain, logistics, and socio-political dynamics required not merely brute force, but nuanced coordination, diplomacy, and an acute understanding of both allies and adversaries. And Graham approached this conflict with the same combination of meticulous planning, ethical consideration, and strategic acumen that had defined his leadership in the Legion, yet now tempered by his commitment to minimize unnecessary bloodshed and to guide actions in accordance with principles of justice, mercy, and the long-term stability of the canyon's communities. And as hostilities intensified, Graham assumed a central role in coordinating the defenses, advising local leaders, training militias, and implementing tactical deployments that leveraged natural choke points, high ground, and knowledge of the surrounding canyons to offset the numerical advantages of the Whitelegs and other hostile factions. And his efforts were informed by decades of experience in terrain, navigation, small unit tactics, psychological operations, and the management of disparate groups with varying degrees of discipline, loyalty, and motivation. Skills he had refined first among canyon tribes, later as Malpais Legate, and subsequently during his survival and reintegration into New Canaan. And these abilities allowed him to anticipate enemy movements, disrupt attacks before they could consolidate, and inspire both confidence and cohesion among defenders who, despite limited training and resources, relied on Graham's guidance to organize effective resistance. And beyond purely tactical considerations, Graham also functioned as a moral and spiritual leader, emphasizing the importance of protecting non-combatants, maintaining ethical conduct in warfare, and fostering unity among groups with different customs, beliefs, and priorities, an approach that mitigated internal strife, strengthened alliances, and ensured that the defense of Zion was not only militarily effective, but socially and ethically coherent. And the campaign involved both conventional and unconventional engagements, including ambushes, reconnaissance, sabotage of enemy supply lines, and defensive fortifications designed to maximize the natural advantages of the canyon's geography, all of which required careful planning, coordination, and adaptability under rapidly changing conditions. And Graham's presence on the field was not only as a strategist, but also as an exemplar of discipline, courage, and moral fortitude, whose personal resilience inspired fighters and civilians alike, reinforcing the psychological component of defense and the broader narrative of righteous resistance against encroaching forces. And throughout the conflict, Graham maintained a constant awareness of the human cost of battle, balancing the necessity of decisive action with the preservation of life wherever possible, a consideration that differentiated his leadership from the unmitigated ruthlessness he had employed in the service of Caesar. and this ethical dimension enhanced both the cohesion and the legitimacy of the defenders, creating a moral as well as tactical foundation for resistance that allowed disparate groups to act in concert toward a common objective. And Graham's strategic input included careful timing of engagements, use of terrain to channel enemy movements into kill zones, coordination of small unit strikes, and the integration of local knowledge provided by inhabitants and scouts, all executed with a precision born of decades of experience, rigorous discipline, and an intimate understanding of the interplay between fear, morale, and the practical realities of combat. And in this way, Graham transformed what might have been a fragmented and reactive defense into a coordinated and effective campaign that leveraged both human and environmental resources, turning the terrain of Zion Canyon into an ally rather than an obstacle. And as the war progressed, Graham's influence extended beyond immediate tactical decisions to the shaping of strategic alliances, the mediation of disputes among allied factions, and the reinforcement of social structures that would endure beyond the immediate conflict, ensuring that the outcomes of the war for Zion were not only measured in victories on the battlefield, but also in the preservation and strengthening of the human and ethical fabric of the Canyon communities, and the successful coordination and defense achieved under his guidance demonstrated the enduring applicability of his skills in leadership, strategy, and ethical governance, showing that the burned man's experience in survival, military command, and moral reflection could be translated into both effective defense and the cultivation of resilience, solidarity, and moral authority in complex, high-stakes conflicts. And in reflecting upon the war for Zion, it becomes evident that Graham's role was instrumental, not only in the tactical success of defensive operations, but also in the long-term stability, moral coherence, and cultural preservation of the canyon's inhabitants, reinforcing his status as a figure whose legacy encompasses both practical achievement and ethical guidance, a man whose life embodies the integration of strategic brilliance, survival skill, moral discipline, and spiritual leadership. And it is through the lens of the war for Zion that one can fully appreciate the culmination of Joshua Graham's evolution from tribal interpreter to feared and ruthless legate to burned man and moral exemplar, as he demonstrated that the lessons of survival, leadership, and ethical reflection could be applied to protect communities, guide warriors, and shape the course of conflict in ways that extended far beyond personal ambition, leaving an indelible mark on both the physical and moral landscape of the post-apocalyptic Southwest. And in doing so, Graham solidified his enduring place as a figure whose legacy combines the practical, the ethical, and the mythic, illustrating that even amidst the most destructive forces of the wasteland, the integration of faith, strategy, and morality can shape outcomes, inspire resilience, and define a legend that will endure across generations. After the war for Zion, Graham managed to cement a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate impact of his survival, tactical brilliance, or moral authority, reaching into the very cultural, ethical, and philosophical fabric of post-apocalyptic society. And his influence manifested not only through direct action, but also through the lessons, precedents, and examples he left for those who lived, fought, and struggled in the harsh realities of a world reshaped by atomic fire. And Graham's life demonstrated that resilience, strategic acumen, and moral reflection could coexist, providing a template for leadership, survival, and ethical engagement that was both practical and aspirational. And the communities he touched, whether through direct guidance, moral example, or the deterrent effect of his legend, benefited from the integration of these principles into everyday life, from the careful management of conflict and resources, to the cultivation of cooperation, loyalty, and ethical reasoning in circumstances where conventional law, order, and societal structures had largely dissolved, and Graham's long-term impact can be traced in multiple domains, from the preservation and strengthening of settlements like New Canaan, where his spiritual guidance, mediation skills, and disciplined example fostered cohesion and moral clarity, to the broader Mojave, where his mythic reputation influenced the behavior, strategies, and ethical considerations of both allies and adversaries, shaping not only tactical decisions in the field, but also the moral framework within which communities evaluated leadership, justice, and the consequences of violence, and his influence was particularly notable in the ways in which he demonstrated that survival alone was insufficient for enduring impact, emphasizing the importance of integrating reflection, ethical deliberation, and the exercise of moral judgment into leadership practices. And by embodying this synthesis of practical survival, strategic expertise, and moral authority, Graham provided a model for others who sought to navigate the wasteland in ways that preserved both life and principle, fostering a culture in which wisdom, discipline, and ethical conduct could coexist with the harsh necessities of post-apocalyptic existence. And his legacy was further reinforced by the persistence of the legend of the burned man, whose story circulated widely across the Southwest, providing cautionary and inspirational narratives that highlighted the consequences of violence, the possibilities of redemption, and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. And these narratives served as both moral guidance and practical instruction, influencing not only individuals' choices in survival, combat, and leadership, but also shaping collective perceptions of justice, honor, and the exercise of authority. And in this way, Graham's life and legend became intertwined, as the factual account of his deeds informed ethical reflection, and the mythic dimensions of his survival and endurance reinforced the practical and moral lessons derived from his experiences, creating a feedback loop in which story, history, and principle mutually strengthened one another. And the communities that benefited from Graham's presence, counsel, and example often demonstrated enhanced cohesion, strategic competence, and ethical awareness, as his approach emphasized careful observation, the anticipation of challenges, disciplined response, and the maintenance of moral clarity even in situations of extreme adversity. And his teachings, whether conveyed directly or implicitly through the example of his life, encouraged individuals to cultivate resilience, resourcefulness, and integrity, thereby multiplying the effect of his experience across generations and geographies. And the influence of Graham's legacy was also evident in the broader political and social dynamics of the Mojave Wasteland, where leaders, settlers, and wandering groups calibrated their strategies, alliances, and ethical standards in light of the stories, lessons, and warnings associated with the burned man, a phenomenon that reinforced both the tangible and symbolic dimensions of his impact. And through this integration of personal example, strategic insight, and moral authority, Joshua Graham contributed to the formation of a culture in which survival was inseparable from the exercise of ethical judgment, the cultivation of resilience, and the responsible use of power, a cultural shift that persisted long after the immediate threats of Caesar's legion, raiders, or other hostile forces had subsided. And the enduring significance of his legacy lies not merely in the feats of survival or military achievement, but in the comprehensive model of leadership, morality, and human potential he embodied, demonstrating that even in the harshest conditions, individuals could act with principle, guide others toward ethical conduct, and influence the course of communities and regions through the careful integration of strategy, faith, and moral reasoning. And it was this combination of practical effectiveness, ethical authority, and mythic resonance that ensured Joshua Graham's enduring place in the history, culture, and collective memory of the Mojave Wasteland, a legacy that continues to shape perceptions of resilience, leadership, and morality in a world forged from the remnants of atomic devastation. And by examining the long-term influence of Graham's life, one can trace the threads of tactical wisdom, moral deliberation, spiritual reflection, and legendary resilience that together form a model for navigating both the material and ethical challenges of a post-apocalyptic society, demonstrating that true influence is measured not merely by immediate outcomes or acts of power, but by the capacity to instill enduring lessons, ethical clarity, and inspiration that guide human behavior across time, space, and circumstance. And it is within this comprehensive understanding of his legacy that the full significance of Joshua Graham emerges, illustrating how one individual, shaped by extreme adversity, disciplined reflection, and moral courage, can leave an indelible mark upon both the practical and symbolic landscapes of human civilization. Even amidst the ruins of a world reshaped by nuclear fire, and in doing so, he transcends the boundaries of ordinary historical figurehood, becoming a paradigm of resilience, ethical leadership, and enduring influence, whose lessons resonate for all who seek to navigate the complex interplay of survival, morality, and human potential in the aftermath of catastrophe. As the decades unfolded after Joshua Graham's miraculous survival, the trials of his life, and his return to New Canaan, he came to embody the complex interplay of resilience, morality, faith, and human capacity for transformation. And it is through a contemplative lens that one can examine the trajectory of his existence as a testament, not merely to the endurance of the body, but to the fortitude of the mind, the discipline of character, and the power of ethical and spiritual reflection to guide action amidst the chaos and devastation of a post-apocalyptic world. For Graham's journey, beginning in the sheltered settlement of New Canaan, where he absorbed the teachings, rituals, and language of his community, and progressing through the violent campaigns, as the first Malpais Legate under Caesar exposed him to both the extremities of human depravity and the extraordinary capabilities of leadership, strategy, and cultural mediation, and these experiences, while formative, left indelible marks upon his psyche, compelling him to confront moral ambiguity, the consequences of obedience, and the ramifications of wielding authority in environments devoid of conventional law and order, and his near-fatal execution in the year 2270, when Caesar ordered him doused in pitch and set aflame at the edge of the Grand Canyon, served as the pivotal crucible in which physical endurance, spiritual reflection, and psychological resilience were tested to the utmost, forging in him a new identity as the burned man, a figure whose survival defied mortal expectation, and whose continued presence became both legendary and instructional for those who encountered his story. And it is within the crucible of suffering that Graham's reflections deepened, as he integrated the lessons of life, death, and moral accountability, recognizing that survival was not merely a matter of avoiding physical harm, but required the cultivation of ethical clarity, the management of human relationships, and the exercise of strategic foresight. And these realizations informed his subsequent actions in New Canaan and the Mojave, where he balanced the duties of leadership, mentorship, and community guidance with the principles of faith, justice, and reconciliation, demonstrating that the lessons of history, experience, and personal trial could be synthesized into a coherent approach to life that honored both human dignity and the necessity of pragmatic decision-making. And Graham's reflections were also informed by his understanding of the human propensity for myth-making. As the legend of the burned man spread across the Southwest, a narrative that both amplified and distilled the essence of his lived experiences, reinforcing the moral, ethical, and strategic dimensions of his identity, while simultaneously serving as a cautionary tale and source of inspiration for those navigating the fractured and often brutal landscape of the wasteland. And in contemplating the trajectory of his life, Graham understood that the endurance of legacy, influence, and moral example often depended less upon the scale of physical achievements and more upon the consistency, integrity, and ethical resonance of one's actions, a principle that he applied in guiding communities, advising leaders, and cultivating resilience among survivors, thereby ensuring that his experiences were translated into lessons of practical, ethical, and spiritual significance. And the synthesis of these reflections, drawn from decades of experience, suffering, and moral deliberation, illuminates the core themes of human endurance, transformation, and the capacity for redemption, illustrating that even amidst the desolation of a post-nuclear society, individuals retain the potential to exercise agency, moral discernment, and principled leadership, shaping the course of events, influencing others, and leaving an enduring imprint on both physical and cultural landscapes. And it is this combination of resilience, ethical insight, and spiritual awareness that distinguishes Joshua Graham as a figure whose life transcends conventional historical or military categorization, positioning him instead as a paradigm through which the human capacity for change, reflection, and moral action can be understood and appreciated. And the reflective process itself, which Graham cultivated through meditation, spiritual practice, and the careful examination of his past deeds, allowed him to reconcile the dualities of his existence, integrating the violence and ruthlessness of his military past with the moral rigor, spiritual discipline, and ethical leadership of his later life, demonstrating that transformation is neither instantaneous nor superficial, but a sustained, deliberate, and often arduous process requiring courage, humility, and unwavering commitment to principle. And in this sense, Graham's life offers a blueprint for navigating the moral complexities of leadership, survival, and ethical responsibility in contexts where the structures of conventional society have been obliterated, showing that the cultivation of resilience, reflection, and moral authority can produce enduring influence and a legacy that transcends immediate circumstances. And the burned man, as both lived experience and myth, thus becomes an emblem of the human capacity to endure unimaginable adversity, to reflect upon the consequences of one's actions, and to transform suffering into insight, guidance, and moral authority, illustrating that survival is inseparable from ethical reflection, that leadership is inseparable from moral responsibility, and that the lessons of experience, however painful, can be translated into enduring guidance for others navigating the challenges of a fragmented, post-apocalyptic world. And as Graham's reflections deepened, he increasingly emphasized the interconnection of faith, morality, and practical action, recognizing that each informed and reinforced the others, and that a life of principle, resilience, and strategic awareness could both protect communities and inspire individuals, creating a legacy in which human potential, ethical reflection, and mythic resonance coexist. And in this final contemplative chapter of his life, Joshua Graham's story stands as a testament to the extraordinary capacities inherent in the human condition. The ability to endure, to reflect, to forgive, to teach, and to inspire. And it is through this lens that one may fully appreciate the burned man, not merely as a survivor of fire, war, and human cruelty, but as an enduring symbol of faith, moral integrity, resilience, and the transformative power of reflection, a figure whose life exemplifies the possibility of change, the impact of ethical action, and the enduring resonance of human courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And as the Mojave Wasteland and its peoples continue to reckon with the consequences of the past, the legend, lessons, and lived experiences of Joshua Graham serve as a guide, a warning, and an inspiration, illustrating that even amidst ruin, human beings retain the capacity for endurance, moral insight, and transformation, and that the story of one individual, forged through fire, reflection, and moral courage, can illuminate the pathways through which others may navigate the desolate and often brutal landscapes of the post-apocalyptic world, leaving a legacy that endures not only in history and myth, but in the ethical, spiritual, and practical decisions of those who follow in his footsteps.